Sally has joined me at the desk, which means it's time for us to take a look at what's making headlines around the world. Let's start with the Financial Times. It weighs up the economic impact of Ebola as the human cost grows. Reports on the World Bank's estimate that West Africa faces a $33 billion economic hit if the outbreak isn't contained.
The Moscow Times front page looks at Russia's reliance on foreign expertise when it comes to developing major oil projects, particularly in the Arctic. Foreign companies were blocked from working in the Russian Arctic last month following sanctions on Russia over its involvement in the Ukraine crisis. Staying with oil, there's this report suggesting in The Guardian victory for Greenpeace as toy maker Lego says it won't renew its multi-million-dollar deal to distribute products at Shell petrol stations. Greenpeace pressured Lego to cut ties with the oil giant over its plans to drill in the Arctic. That's in The Guardian. Could it be the beginning of the end for secretive Swiss banking? The Swiss government says it will soon start talks with other countries about automatically sharing data on bank accounts held by foreigners. That's in Le Figaro. More whining and dining for Chinese holidaymakers. China Daily reports on changing spending patterns. It notes consumers are splashing out more on food and entertainment when they're on holiday. And finally, is Japan's business culture stifling innovation? That's one of the three joint winners of this year's Nobel Prize in Physics says he fled Japan for the United States because the environment holds back entrepreneurs and new ideas. That's in the Japan Times today. A lot of very interesting stories to rattle through. Joining us to do so is Rolake Akinkugbe. She's the head of energy and natural resources at FBN Capital. Joins us at the desk after a spell away, I think. Glad to have you back. Nice to see you again, Rolake.
Let's start with this really worrying story. I mean, Ebola is a horrible crisis, as we've been reporting on, but now the World Bank is suggesting a huge economic hit to the countries that are affected, and they just can't afford that, can they?
No, they can't, and it's worth bearing in mind that the $33 billion the World Bank has put out is actually the worst-case scenario. There's a less severe case, which is around $3 billion in economic output would be lost. The other point that's worth making that the actual Ebola epidemic is really a function of the health infrastructure in many of these countries, and I think that's where we should see some level of economic cooperation and aid. If you look at those countries, if you look at some of the mining sectors, we're seeing foreign companies and multinationals pull back workers. The services industry has also been affected. But I think the case of Nigeria is one example of a country that did face an outbreak, was able to contain it with real quick, immediate action and support from the international community.
And that was quite early on, wasn't it? Because we were reporting on the case that was discovered in Lagos, and you've moved to Lagos, which is why we're not seeing you as often on the paper review. I mean, just explain how that was then. I mean, the commercial district of Nigeria, there was a real fear that if it was to spread there, it would be pretty catastrophic, and yet Nigeria was on it.
And the fear was perhaps legitimate because Lagos, Nigeria's commercial capital, is about 20 million strong in terms of population, and it is a transport hub for the West Africa region. But I think the quick response helped, the recognition that there was a need to isolate and quarantine cases and monitor cases. Now, it's not the case that you have the same level of health infrastructure across the region, but I think what is positive now is that the cases we're seeing internationally is helping to put this on a global scale and perhaps draw a greater level of attention to what is really a serious crisis.
I think we could spend the entire paper review talking about this issue, but let's move on to the Moscow Times. Its headline there, Arctic oil delays loom amid West sanctions. It's great that you're here because you also have a connection to this oil story.
Yeah, I mean,
natural resources
it's a really interesting one, and there's two sides to this. There's the issue of whether we should be exploring for oil in the Arctic anyway, but for Russia, will this have a severe financial impact? Probably not in the short term. The truth is that Rosneft does need international partners, particularly on the technology front, to drive exploration and drilling, which runs into hundreds of millions of dollars. But we're actually off-peak in terms of the exploration season in the Arctic.
So
we might not see it. It's a very short 3-month period, and we might not see the real impact till next year if the sanctions continue into 2000.
Well, it's quite interesting because, I mean, the Moscow Times says that Western companies' input is crucial in this, and it talks about the fact that foreign oil companies were suddenly blocked.
They were suddenly blocked, and that was a change in policy
with the
from
likes of Rosneft.
Previous months before, yes. But it was interesting to see how this plays out.
But how lucrative is it, potentially? this oil in the Arctic?
In the Arctic, overall, we're talking about 166 billion barrels of oil. In the Kara Sea, which is where Rosneft and the other internationals are operating, we're looking at around 750 million barrels of oil, which is it's not child's play. It could have a significant transformational impact on oil output in the region.
I want to talk to you about whether we should be drilling for oil in the Arctic, but we have to move on, I'm being told.
Well, this is about that.
This
is about
this
it.
story on The Guardian, Greenpeace victory as Lego ditches Shell. So there was this video, I don't know if you saw that video on YouTube, that Greenpeace had made that was trying to persuade Lego to pull out of its deal with Shell. 6 million people viewed it on YouTube, and they say that they've now managed to win their case.
And the issue is here, sorry, you may be just about to say this, is Shell is planning to drill in the Arctic. So the video shows this massive Lego city in the Arctic. That's what the viral video is all about, isn't it?
Yeah, and it does cause some thinking around these corporate partnerships and whether companies can be indirectly liable or actually face indirect reputational risks as a result of the types of corporate partnerships they pursue. It's worth bearing in mind that in the past, Greenpeace has also forced perhaps Unilever and Indonesia to back down over palm oil extraction in some of the forest regions of that country. But what Lego is saying that it will continue to execute its current contract with Shell, which has been in place in 2011, and perhaps going forward, it will review and stop partnering with the company.
And it's quite interesting that Lego was pinpointed because what Shell and Lego deal is all about is you get Lego when you go to a Shell garage. In 26 countries around the world. There are many other companies that have similar deals with Shell, I'm sure, where you get, various products and freebies.
Absolutely. It might cause for a rethink, but this is certainly an interesting case.
Is it going to affect Shell?
Probably not on a grander scale, but it does sort of shed light on the reputational risk a lot of the big extractives companies face globally.
Let's move on to Le Figaro. The headline there, La Suisse annonce la fin du secret bancaire pour 2018.
Fantastic.
I practiced that earlier, actually. Basically, potentially the end of secret banking in Switzerland. Blimey, what's going to be left in Switzerland?
This is going to be a real policy shift in the Swiss banking industry. As we know, it's an issue that does affect many countries around the world who are worried about tax evasion. And if you recall, at the G8 summit months back, this is one of the core issues on the agenda.
It has been for quite a few
G8
G8
for quite a few years, but now
it
it's really gathering momentum. And the idea is by 2018, we'll start to see information exchange between Swiss banking authorities and other countries that enter into these agreements with Switzerland, and particularly within the European Union.
What's it going to mean for Swiss banking and the Swiss economy?
Well, in terms of the Swiss economy, I'm not sure it necessarily serves as a disincentive from people coming to invest. I think we're going to see several iterations around the amount of disclosure. It's worth bearing in mind that the Swiss already, to some extent, make anonymous tax payments around some of these accounts held by foreigners in the country to some governments with which it has bilateral deals. So it will be a gradual phased process, I imagine.
Now, let's swiftly move on because we're running out of time. China Daily, holiday spending habits change. This is a state-sponsored newspaper. Of course, we've just come to the end of a week holiday in China, a massive public holiday. And it's looking at how people have spent their time, what they've done with their money during that time.
Yeah, the biggest shift is the shift away from the sort of luxury goods market to services and holiday makers from China just wanting to have a good time. It's also interesting to see the geographic regions they're spending a lot of this. Typically, Asia within their regional hub is quite attractive, but the growth in the US and Thailand in particular of Chinese spending is phenomenal. I think globally, Chinese tourists and holiday makers will be spending over $100 billion in 2014.
And they didn't spend it in Hong Kong this time.
No, not in Hong Kong.
Because of the protests.
Yeah, right
which
on
was
their
interesting.
doorstep. Absolutely.
All right. Finally, let's look at this last story, which is on the front of the Japan Times. One of its Nobel laureates, the physics winner, said that he left Japan because its business culture stifles innovation, moved to Santa Barbara in California. Now, if you've ever been to Santa Barbara, you can understand why he moved there. Do you think Japan stifles innovation?
Well, I mean, it's a really, I mean, this is certainly one man's experience. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a broader reflection of what pertains in the economy, but the whole spirit of entrepreneurship is quite a crucial aspect of economic growth. And perhaps when you contrast Japan with California, certainly it's a bit of apples and oranges in terms of innovation.
OK,
yeah.
Rolake Akinkugbe, we're going to have to leave it there. Excellent to talk to you. Thank you very much for coming in.
Nice to have you back, isn't
Sally
it?
and I will see you in a minute.
Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.